like we are at. Great. Welcome, everyone. We're going to start right on time. This is being recorded, so anybody who jumps in a little bit late can maybe catch the little intro from the recording. So thanks for attending today. Appreciate it. I want to thank Rutgers for providing this venue, and David Lipsey, who's with us here, is the co-director of the DAM certificate program in particular, for making this happen. So there's lots to cover. With the first hour, we're basically is going to be me presenting, and then at the hour, we're going to bring in some friends to help us. All right, so let's go ahead and jump forward here. So a little bit about me. I've been in the DAM space for many years. The last 10 years, I've worked for a couple different DAM platform vendors. Prior to that, I was an independent consultant working on a number of enterprise DAM projects. At the hour, we're going to bring Erica and Ben in, and I'll let them introduce themselves. They are actual 3D experts. So with that, I'll give you a caveat. I am by no means a 3D expert. I've been in DAM for decades, but my goal here is to explain some of the basic concepts with enough context to help DAM practitioners execute projects that involve 3D. I'm also lumping together many different disciplines of 3D work, like CGI and CAD and 3D design, industry-specific stuff, to just generalize for our purposes here. So if you're from the 3D world, I apologize in advance if I'm using like incorrect terminology or glossing over some important nuance. But then again, that's why we have Erica and Ben that will be joining at the hour. Other thing is we have attendees from many different industries and different sectors. My experience has mostly been on the commercial side of DAM solutions, some government, some higher ed, but I'm going to reference commercial organizations, and in particular, mostly product-oriented firms. Now, of course, this translates, the same principles translate across different sectors and different end purposes of the 3D content, like 3D artifacts in a museum or something like that. And I'll try to draw some analogies as I go through to other sectors. So here is what we are going to cover today. I'm not even going to go through this right now. I'm just going to jump right into it. But if you want to review it later, there's the agenda. Okay, so why are we talking about 3D? So over the last few years, I've been hearing from more and more teams that are working on solutions for, or that seek solutions for 3D. There's a wide range of stakeholders and different types of 3D content. But what I found is they all need DAM-like capabilities. But DAM software and software implementations aren't necessarily designed for effectively supporting 3D assets at this stage. Now, I want to point out, many of these teams that I have spoken with would never call this DAM. They've even said to me explicitly, oh, no, this isn't DAM. That's for marketing. That's for images, Adobe Creative Cloud stuff. That's for those other teams. We have a different problem, but it's versioning, findability, permissions, lifecycle control. We have a large file transfer problem, or we have a sharing problem, or we need a content exchange portal, but it's all DAM, or at least the same kind of capability under the hood there. The thing is it's different teams, they use different tools, and they work with different content. But it's kind of like the same old problems for those that have been around DAM. So there's more and more teams struggling with this. Now, as I said, 3D support in the DAM software is fairly recent, and there's different levels of support, but overall, it's still somewhat limited kind of as an industry, at least compared with the level of support you would get for, let's say, like the Adobe CC asset types that we're all familiar with. So I apologize for this, but the dam, pun intended, is about to break, and there's a flood of 3D content that's going to be coming down, and firms are starting to really feel this pain. So there's a bunch of different use cases for DAM for 3D in DAM. Couple just to kind of highlight it. Managing the actual 3D product designs like CAD and other tools from which things are actually manufactured. Then as you move downstream in the supply chain, which I'll explain in a moment, you have sort of replacing more traditional imagery by rendering outputs from those 3D designs, like instead of photo shoots. And there are many other variations of that. And then as you go further down the supply chain towards the consumer side, there's a wide range of more kind of immersive and engaging experiences for consumers that firms are trying to deliver. And the need for that is really exploding, and it's putting pressure on the content production teams. Okay, so let's just do a very high level overview of kind of what are 3D assets. And again, I'm not an expert. I'm just trying to give enough context on why we have certain challenges with 3D in DAM. First thing I'll say, my opinion, 3D assets are inherently more complex than other formats. There's just more information there for a human to interact with. So there's a bit more consideration that goes into properly managing them. The other thing is there are many tools and formats. So I'm wildly generalizing kind of across all these different disciplines for like a general business audience. So you can first divide it into two aspects. There's the mesh. That's kind of like the underlying model, the shape. It's usually the main edit file. Like, if you were in InDesign, that would be the main edit file and you would drop stuff into it. So that's the main edit file, and it's the geometrical shape. It's defined as polygons, and the resolution of that is usually defined as the number of polygons. So there's high polygon assets, which are basically like higher resolution, more accurate to a real world shape. And you can see in this example, the face has a lot smaller, more refined polygons than the hair, which is pretty blocky. Then you have the materials. This is what gets put onto the model, the actual colors, the patterns, also how they interact with the environment. Is it shiny or dull? How rough is it? How does it reflect light? I think that's called albedo. It's image pixels plus filters plus other physical properties. And together they're often just called materials from what I've seen. Point is, editable assets are not usually a single file. Okay, so for context, just again, to kind of get our heads around this, an image is just a grid of pixels. It's just like spreadsheet cells, right? With values in each cell. They can be really big and have a lot of pixels, but that's all they are. And sure, you can have layers and things like that, but it's still just a grid. Then you have vector artwork, like Illustrator, for example, and that's just mathematical curves in a 2D, like an XY space. 3D is both of those simultaneously, plus a bunch of physical characteristics. Now, I should point out that CAD is also 3D, but it contains a lot more specification, like for engineering and manufacturing. But CAD can be converted into 3D formats to be made more visually accurate or visually attractive. So let's go a little bit deeper. So another way to look at this, or just to explode this a little bit more, is you have your mesh, your model. So you can see here in the example, over on the right, we've got a final rendered 3D. And obviously this is just an image, but in 3D, you'd be able to rotate this around. So we've got the mesh, that's the 3D shape. It's a bunch of polygons. This example is like super uniform, right? Because it's just a sphere. It's very simple. Then you have that kind of wood grain texture. That is just an image file. It's the color and the pattern, which gets wrapped around. But then you also have sort of materials, sort of other layers that add in sort of potentially optical properties or different filters that help the eye interpret the woven pattern. So if you look at the final render, if you were to imagine running your hand down that ball, you would expect to feel ridges. Well, in the same way that you look at a painting of the Dutch masters, you see perspective, right? So it's a kind of a combination of actual physics and then kind of what we know about art and perception. At least that's kind of my take on it. So the items that are being applied to the mesh are of many different types. It's image, colors, how they interact with light. And the point is, these are often multiple files, depending on the editing app and the format. So there is literally more content here than a 2D image or a vector design. Now you could say a video has more bytes, maybe. Yeah, it might, but it's just a bunch of images in sequence. Whereas 3D designs have numerous distinct types of components that are put together. Now you can also imagine that ball, that woven ball, that's just one part of a larger design. So now you have many different textures and many different materials all in the same design, right? Like the thing we just, of the woman from the previous slide, there's the hair, there's the face, there's all these different components. So there's more there to manage. But this is also why 3D can be reused in many more ways than other asset types. They're simply more valuable and reusable than other asset types, in my opinion. Now, CAD, like I said, is 3D, but it contains a lot more technical specification, like engineering, manufacturing, 3D printing, et cetera. Physics, mechanical properties, stresses, loads, thermodynamics. I'm not an engineer, but there's a lot more kind of physics and scientific data that's there. But from that, you can export and then into 3D apps that are meant more for appearance and also functionality, like maybe how you would interact with it. So that's often a source for this content. Now, To layer on another level, there's also how those models interact with an environment, perhaps, right? So you could have examples of like wind as a force that's variable over time, and then how the object is interacting with it, right? So that might be creating, well, that's animation basically, right? When you're, doing animation work. So there's other data that's affecting it, and there's potentially other assets that are being used there. And then you have like material design. So how that fabric design, which is a 3D model, would interact with like a sphere or a ball. Like what would the drape look like, right? So now you're producing, you're bringing multiple pieces together. The ball itself is an object, and you're putting the two together. You want to test the characteristics of the fabric, or how something malleable would deform under force, right? And then, of course, things like apparel designs, how is it actually going to fit on a particular avatar or a particular model? So I'm just pointing out there are more assets, but they also might interact with each other. So it's creating more design types across many different industries. And it means there's additional related content to manage. And also, each of these can create more derivatives based on these kind of interactions. So models can be used in other models, they can be used in scenes, they can be used in environments. Again, making them more reusable, but also more complex to manage. So here's the way I've kind of organized it. People could disagree with me. I tried to kind of classify these. You've got your main 3D designs. So 3D designs, CAD, maybe industry-specific formats, the edit files. And then you've got the stuff you use in them. You've got materials, textures, there's like lights, there's blocks like that ball, there's avatars, there's things that get kind of used in those. Either as an actual material, as an actual surface on the mesh, or as other components that are used inside of it. So those top two rows together are the native assets that are editable, right? Then you can create renders from that. Just like we make a PDF from a lot of different formats, and it's universally playable and widely supported, that's kind of the idea with these 3D renders. GLB is a common format. I kind of think of it as the PDF of 3D. There are other formats too. But basically, the idea is it's all wrapped up into one. It's not really that editable, but it's a view of it. And this is the level that a lot of DAM vendors support. And then you have non-3D outputs, animations, images, turntables, walkthroughs, all sorts of things like scenes, that sort of thing, which are super important because they're derived from upstream. So these are kind of the different classes of content that we need to be able to manage in a DAM. And of course, they're extremely related to each other. So now let's talk about some of the use cases, go into a little more detail on what I already was doing some highlighting. Now, this is for a product firm, obviously, so you can kind of translate to other industries and other purposes. So first off, the first category is kind of native 3D design work, digital product creation. And I can sort of subdivide it into different categories. There's product design. So where you take materials or parts or components and you build a product. And a lot of times this is industry specific. So I've had some experience in the apparel and footwear industry, and they have specific tools they use to build, especially like apparel, for example. So it's using those tools to build something, to build a product. Then you have what I'm going to call engineering design. This is more CAD oriented. So it's starting in CAD. It's more the spec for manufacturing. And those teams may have content management systems like engineering document management systems for CAD. It's more like a typical document management system for production teams. But CAD can be converted to 3D for visualization, for marketing, for promotion, because CAD doesn't necessarily represent the accurate appearance of something. It's the technical data needed to build the thing often. Now, in some industries, there's this notion of a digital twin. It's the digital representation of the actual physical thing. And what a lot of firms are doing, some firms have already achieved this, are driving towards all digital prototyping. So they never have to make a physical prototype, which is slow and tedious and has to get shipped around. So it's a lot faster product development time and faster time to market, which is what this is all about. And then you have media and entertainment, and that's 3D mostly for like CGI, that type of thing. And it's not just the film and TV shows and games and ads, but it's like the actual 3D designs that are used for the sets or props or mechanicals. Like I spoke to one that they scan their physical props, 3D scan their physical props, and then bring those into CGI to make whatever they make, games and such. So there's a lot of different ancillary 3D assets that are created. Then we move into the next phase, which is more the kind of B2B visualization. So This is downstream in the supply chain, which I'll talk in a minute, where you're creating renderings and derivatives for a bunch of different business purposes. So it's making 3D accessible by non-design staff. Just like you'd want to make an InDesign available for someone who doesn't have InDesign and needs to view a PDF. But 3D offers a lot better visualization. And it's also the best source to render 2D assets, images, and such, obviously at less cost than an actual photo shoot. So, this idea of replacing photo shoots with 3D renders is not new. This is well-established practice, and a lot of companies have been doing it for a long time. I talked to IKEA a decade ago, and they were doing this to create different, living room scenes, that sort of thing. But this is often to support internal audiences. So we have to sell to retailers. You don't want to ship them samples. You want to give them a digital sample and make it high quality enough where they can agree to buy X number of widgets, for planning, merchandisers, store design, that sort of thing. Then we get to the last mile, which is driving consumer experiences, giving them 3D visualization, which still isn't, a lot of firms do it, but it's not like the standard by any means. Also creating traditional imagery and then creating these more immersive experiences. So these are consumer-ready assets. They're in context, they're polished, they're regionalized, they're personalized. Just like we have to prepare an image to go on Instagram different than we have to prepare it for a different social media channel, for a different site or something like that. These assets have to be prepared and targeted and fed into those particular systems as well. So those are kind of three major buckets, but let's actually look at a supply chain and talk about kind of how this fits. So this is a notion of a content supply chain. This is for a product-oriented firm, but I will posit that content supply chains exist in all industries. They may look different and they're going to have different stages, but there's always kind of a pipeline, and it's focused around what is the purpose of the organization. In this case, we're a product company. We want to sell product. We make and sell product. That's what we do. So the supply chain serves that. So you've got your kind of phases: plan, create, manufacture, sell, and those kind of overlap with each other. And to put this in context, most work we do today as employees is digital. So these teams are creating all sorts of digital artifacts and all sorts of digital assets. Not all of it belongs in a DAM, but a good chunk of it does. And that's the idea, that these boxes represent different teams that work with different sets of assets that reference or need different data. So each stage usually builds on the content created from upstream. Now, our goal is to accelerate this whole supply chain, so moving faster at less cost. So to put this in context, bringing a product to market months faster. Now, I'm not saying DAM can deliver this alone, but it's a key element of the infrastructure to make that happen. So there are use cases for 3D at almost every stage of this supply chain. Now, I also want to point out there's tons of non-3D content that's also required by these teams simultaneously that goes with it. So it's not like you can just say, oh, we're just going to map this out for 3D content. No, there's sketches and diagrams and all sorts of other things, briefs, and all sorts of other data that assets that have to go with these 3D assets. So going down the chain, materials and product design are fairly obvious. So you have a materials library, it's all the components, it's what you build your products from. Obviously, there's assets there, they have to be managed. Then there's the actual product design piece, where you have to manage those assets, not just designs, but like sketches and ideas and prototypes and digital samples and things like that. So then as we move to the right, you have, and you could reorder these in different ways, but this is just a conceptual diagram. You have the kind of photo shoot stage. So a lot of imagery can now be derived from 3D product designs, and it can be targeted and personalized, like that idea of placing a couch in a living room. What it looks like in Southern Europe is very different than what it needs to look like in a Nordic country. I remember that was what IKEA talked about. So they can do that virtually instead of literally creating these expensive photo shoots. So there's that sort of stage, and there's some ideas of different types of assets that get created at that. Packaging. So a lot of product imagery has to end up on packaging, right? And the packaging designs themselves may have aspects of 3D or CAD, right? Especially if there's a virtual representation of the package, like in some virtual environment, you see the box or whatever. Retail planning, so showroom designs, store plans, all that stuff can be 3D, as well as, of course, virtual showrooms, creating that environment, which crosses over into immersive a little bit. Then we have marketing asset hub. This one's important because this is the traditional finished asset marketing DAM. It's what most of us are familiar with when we think of DAM. And the reason those teams I talked to earlier said, oh, no, we don't need DAM, because they think of that box as DAM. But that's very limited compared to the full scope of content that's required to facilitate this supply chain. But of course, it's still an important piece. And it's what DAM is traditionally used for. It's to feed all the downstream systems, to feed all sorts of marketing, promotions, operations. Then we have immersive experiences. This one's really important. I'll talk about it more later, but this is a range of tools and systems that can deliver these experiences, and they are highly dependent on 3D content coming from upstream. So, they can enable 3D kind of everywhere. So there's solutions that's dedicated software and platforms that can embed in e-commerce and various websites, deliver configurators, VR, AR games, that sort of stuff. There's new technology needed to be able to serve this. And then, of course, on the right is your last mile, all the places where, and there's many more, of course, where consumers or partners might interact with, and they can be fed from the marketing asset hub or the immersive product experiences. So while we're here, let's talk about how firms are managing 3D content today. So some stages have DAM, like the marketing asset hub. But as I said before, it's still somewhat limited in 3D support. Now, many of the other boxes on this diagram are still using file systems, enterprise file sync and share like Box and Dropbox. They're using SharePoint sites. They have basic DAM needs, permissions, lifecycle control, sharing, versioning, search beyond just the file name. This is DAM 101, right? So there's a real need and there's a real opportunity for DAM in these areas. But there's actually a larger issue, which is their assets are completely detached from all the operational data that drives their processes and their decision making. So I'll come back to that later. Now, I want to point out there are other solutions that are industry specific, kind of 3D solutions that have content repository capabilities. So I don't want to say DAM is the only solution, but they tend to be more work group, kind of work in progress focused. So kind of like in video, you've got media asset management systems for doing video production, but then the outputs, which is great for those video teams, the output of that then still has to go into a DAM so that it can be more widely distributed and used across the organization. And I would argue it's the same thing here. You may use those 3D work group solutions, but you can't, but they're also silos. You can't have an insular, we only care about our team's needs approach, because that's not well integrated into the supply chain. And then the other thing is that it's really hard to be able to tie into enterprise data a bunch of different silos. If you have it aggregated at an enterprise-wide level, that also makes the data integration a lot easier. So that's the idea of the supply chain. Let's talk about what the actual challenges are for 3D and DAM. Okay, so I'm not going to read through these right now. These are just kind of the headers. Let's just dive in. So the first one is there are tons of 3D formats. This is about 50 file extensions that I found, and this is just a subset. There's many more. And the reason is for a couple of reasons. There's tons of design tools, more than any other creative sector I've ever seen. But also each design has a bunch of different components that all has separate files of different types. And designs may be aggregates of many design elements. So you may have many different kind of materials and other components. I mean, if you compare this to images, if you go to Wikipedia and look at image formats, they'll have 50, 80 formats or whatever, DICOM for medical imaging. But in reality, 98% of the images we deal with are probably 3 or 4 formats like JPEG, PNG, TIFF, PSD, or whatever. It's just not true for 3D. Now, in a certain sector, in a certain team, yeah, they'll be like, oh, these are the formats we work with. But as you look across industries, across different purposes and different stages, there's just this huge range. So the DAM systems have to manage that. We don't have to be able to be experts in these. We don't have to read every detail out of them. We don't have to process them. We have to be able to store them and make sure that people can preview them and search and do all the things that DAM is supposed to do. Now, I said there's many design tools. So this is not like, oh, Adobe Creative Cloud dominates and there's some other tools that people use. This is like there's 10 Adobe Creative Clouds. That's what it seems like to me. And there's a couple of reasons for this. So these are more complex assets, means there's more functionality, there's more you can do to them. So there's more app specialization that are focused on doing certain things. There's a lot of crossover too, but people like different apps for different things. There's also designer preferences. Some of these apps have really steep learning curves, so you're going to use what you know. The other thing is that it can be use case specific. So there's different strengths and weaknesses for doing different things. Like the tools used for CGI work and animation, media, and entertainment is often quite different from product design versus doing photorealistic rendering, that sort of thing. And likewise, different stages of production and derivative creation are, they're used in sequence, just like you would do a shoot, you edit in Photoshop, you drop it into Illustrator artwork, then you place that artwork in InDesign, same idea. It's just there are many more different tools and many more different pathways. So if I have to categorize these tools, I'll kind of look at it like this. We've got CAD, which is 3D, and that's for doing kind of engineering design, a lot of product design. You have materials and textures design apps that are just for designing the textures. You have general 3D modeling apps, which are kind of the main editing apps. But again, there's different preferences and different orientations, but they're generally like 3D apps. You have industry-specific apps, like in apparel, there's specific apps for that. Then you have tools for downstream rendering, creating derivatives, animations, and turntables and images and things like that. And then finally, you have preparing immersive experiences. So when you feed into these immersive experience platforms, there's stuff you have to do to these assets in some cases, maybe create new assets to actually feed that. So some of the common apps, I'll just rattle some off, are Alias, Wavefront, ZBrush, Cinema 4D, 3ds Max, Modo, Rhino, SolidWorks, Maya, Blender, and of course AutoCAD. And then for like apparel, there's specific ones like Browseware, Clo. They're very specific to apparel. And then there's the materials apps, like one of them is Adobe Substance, right? And I'm sure there's some crossover, and there's the apps are always competing with each other, but that's just a sampling. Now, this results in many kinds of proprietary asset files, usually multiple files per design, and they're all linked together, and they have to remain linked together to be editable. There are many different formats of each, and all the derivatives from those are also created, and those all have to be tracked. And just to make it more fun, many of these files are very large as well, so the systems have to have the capacity and the performance to handle them. Okay, so let's talk about that notion that there's multiple files. So this is a compound asset problem. It's not unique to 3D. We see it with InDesign and video and other things, but it's particularly prevalent in 3D. So let me explain what I'm talking about. Compound assets are assets that require multiple files used as a set. Sometimes I use the term file set. So typically there's a main edit file that's specific to the editing application, and then there's a bunch of component files that are used in it. So InDesign is an example. You got your InDesign, you drop your placed artwork and images, and that all has to remain. Another one is like a Premiere project, which is the example on screen. So we have our main Premiere file, that's our video edit file. And then we have all the video clips and all the audio tracks and all the graphics and the special effects. And that hierarchy all has to be preserved. Otherwise, you can't really open that Premiere file. It won't find anything. We all know what broken links are like in InDesign. So the DAM has to be able to treat it like an asset, but also keep track of all the components and also manage all the components. So the reason I bring this up is because most 3D are compound assets. So I've got a couple examples here. So on the left, we have a 3D model. Now, this is a very common format. It's an OBJ format. And so you can see the actual files that are used to create this 3D. So we have the OBJ, that's the main edit file. We have an MTL file, which is kind of like a related materials file. It's part of that format. And then you have these PNGs, that represent different textures. And you can see I've blown a couple of them up. So the zipper, you can see that's the actual image that's used, that's tiled up that jacket to represent the zipper. But then, of course, there's how light bounces off it, and a lot of that's captured in the other files. There's also a GLB file, which is like the PDF of 3D. That's how I think about it. It's packaged, it's ready to preview, it's more widely playable in a lot of different environments, including DAMs. Now, in order to edit this asset, I need to open the OBJ, and all these files need to be in their expected locations. They could be in subfolders. Here, they're just all in one folder. Now, that's an example of a 3D model, but even materials themselves can be compound. Now, the example I have on the right, this is really specific to the apparel industry, but I just want to give you an idea. So this is a fabric design. It's actually typically created by scanning a physical material, and it creates this U3M file, which is kind of like the main, edit file, if you will. And then there's all these textures, alpha channel roughness and sort of how light interacts with it and a bunch of other things that I don't entirely understand, actually. but they're all necessary to use that particular fabric. And you can see there's also a preview of it. There's a ping. That's actually the gray box that's up there if you can see the texture. There's also a physics file that controls kind of how it works. So these materials are then used in the 3D designs. Now, I'm not saying a specific file from this gets used in that OBJ file necessarily. In fact, this material would be used in an apparel application, not just in this OBJ design. But just conceptually, there's a relationship there where pieces from one are used in the other. So the point here is to manage compound assets, we have to preserve the sanctity of the folder and the folder structure, which a lot of creatives already know because they come from working on file systems and they understand a lot of those issues. But it presents some challenges. So the first thing is we have to ensure that we have the full set of functionality we would expect on any asset. What am I talking about? Sure, it may be a bunch of files, but I have to be able to preview it. I have to be able to know what lifecycle state is this approved, reviewed, in review, expired, whatever. I have to be able to share it. I have to have the full set of permissions. I need to be able to version it, take it through workflows, maybe rules like when the expiration date equals today's date, go change permissions or change the lifecycle state. So we need to be able to do all those things. And you can see in this little example from a DAM UI, I have a preview, but then I've got the full set of all the actual subcomponents. Those are assets in and of themselves. They all have metadata too, but they're sort of children or they're sort of related to this overall compound asset. So this introduces some complexities. We have lifecycle state that we have to track, but wait, how does that work? We have a parent or we have the compound and then we have the component. If I change the lifecycle state of the parent, let's say it goes from draft to approved, what do I do to the children? Do I change their lifecycle state? There's no one right or wrong answer. I posit that DAM systems have to be able to do both. They have to be configurable enough to do both. Same thing with permissions. If I approve the compound, what happens to the children? Sometimes you might want to say, well, sure, you could download the compound asset and get all the children, but you can't go in and find or browse or download the children individually. That may be a requirement, depending. And this is going to vary from team to team as you move through the life cycle. It's not like there's one right answer for all teams. Same thing with versioning. If I version the compound, that goes to V2, what happens to the children? And the children may have not changed. So there may not be a reason to take the zipper texture file to V2 because nothing changed. It was something else that changed in the compound asset. So my point is that these are things you have to think about during implementation, and hopefully you're working with software that allows you to have this kind of flexibility. And there's one more level to it, which is what if one of the child assets, one of the components, gets used in multiple compound assets? And there's two models. We share the component or we don't share the component. They both have very valid reasons for taking that approach. The other thing is that the UI, or you need to tell the user. So if you look at the jacket, follow the animation here, you scroll down, you get to the zipper, we view the zipper, that's an image file. At the top, it says used in compound. Oh, that zipper was used in the jacket and that shoe. You see what I mean? So it knows the relationships. That's really important to be able to expose that to users. So when you have this shared versus not shared, there's different reasons. If you're using a shared asset and someone updates it, it's going to affect both assets. Maybe you want that. Maybe you don't. Maybe what you want to do is let each designer upload the same shared asset, but they don't know about each other and there's no dependency. So they're essentially duplicates. You can think of it that way. But you don't want them to show up as duplicates in search, right? But you want them to be completely independent from each other and have their own metadata. So very good reasons for both. I can go into different use cases for why, but the DAMs have to be able to support this stuff. So the next thing that DAMs need to do is visualization. So we all know we need previews in DAM, but there's different kinds of previews that are required for 3D. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I think it's fairly straightforward. So first one, I put the little numbers up there. High quality visualization. So this is really high res. You're using really high poly count assets, right? So they're going to be a lot bigger for things like digital prototyping and approval. So let's say that you're going to use digital prototype and someone's going to make an approval to manufacture 10,000 widgets. It better be right. So it's not only just the resolution and the quality of it, but you might need controls for lighting to be able to move lighting around. You might want to change camera position. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other things that they want to do to really inspect and evaluate. Now, that's not appropriate for every user. There's a subset of users that is really appropriate for, but it's very important because otherwise you have to take the file into the native app. And the people that are doing the approvals often don't have those apps, don't want to work with those apps. Then we have more of a consumer level visualization. That's number 2. And a caveat here, I took a really low res example here. So I'm not saying this is the quality that most consumers would expect. I was just trying to juxtapose it. So it's sufficient quality, much faster loading for consumer users to identify it and evaluate it well enough. It still can look really, really good. I'm just saying it's not necessarily the level when the control that, like a prototype approval would use. It's fast, and it's also ideally universally deployable in websites and social and apps. And some of the tools out there have like this fantastic compression that's akin to like TIFF versus JPEG with like the same quality. We use JPEGs all the time, and they look just as good as TIFFs, and they're a tenth the size or whatever. Then we have non-3D. So this is really common. So these are the chairs, and you can see there's a front, back, left, right type thing. It could be an animation, it could be a video, it could be a turntable, but it's not 3D. And maybe these are needed for integrated systems. So there are systems out there that like merchandisers or planning teams or internal portals, and they just don't support 3D, right? So you have to, give them something that they can work with. Sometimes you want to share assets with people, and you're not going to share a GLB file. Most people don't know what to do with that. So you need to export some images to share with whoever, right? So there's a need for these, and these can kind of ideally be automatically rendered, but at least be stored with the asset. And then we have this photorealistic rendering. So this is number 4. So this is actually a UI from a product called Keyshot, and it's a tool. It's not part of the DAM, at least not yet, but it's used to kind of create scenes or the equivalent of like product photography, and it can also do 3D renderings, I believe. So whether it's 3D or 2D photo, think about that. That drill is the actual model. That's what came from CAD. It went through, all the 3D work. It looks beautiful. Maybe they approved it. They're building the thing. But now you need to show it in context. So you need to put it with that wood grain. The lighting has to match. It has to look completely natural. Maybe you want to make a 3D rendering, that sort of thing, right? So what a lot of teams would love to have some of this in the DAM. They would really love that, to be able to do that. But the point is it's also producing a bunch of derivative assets that you might want to keep with the DAM, with that asset in the DAM. Then you have future state. They want even more editing, maybe product configurators. If you're a retailer that's buying stuff from a brand, you want to see all the different colors, you want to see all the different options in the DAM. That would be, or in some kind of a portal, maybe driven by the DAM. So they want things like that. And then I also should mention, it's not just 3D models, it's materials. I don't have an example of that here, but remember that gray fabric? Well, you would want to see the flat gray fabric. What does it look like? But you also might want to see it draped over the ball. I've heard that called a test render. I want to see how this thing is actually going to render out on a certain condition, on the ball or on a model or something, on an avatar or something like that, right? So you need to see different context for that. So DAMs have to be able to support these different views for these different types of asset objects. Okay, so now I'm going to get into relationships. So this is kind of an intro slide, just to highlight. I'm going to talk about 2 different kinds of relationships. So we talked about compound assets, and in a sense, there's a relationship there. There's this same file is used in this other file. That's very kind of tactical, very hard level, where like literally this file is used in this file as a compound asset. Set that aside for now. What I'm talking about here are more general conceptual relationships that are managed at the database level. And we have asset to asset relationships, and we have asset to data relationships. Asset to asset is important across DAM. It's not just for 3D, but I find that it's even more important for 3D because of the way the assets are related to each other, like between components and their models, or the parts that are used, or derivatives. But it's also used for things like derivatives and translations throughout DAM. Like you crop and you have a banner and you say where that image come from, and there's this is the derivative of this other asset. And then we get to assets and data. This is perhaps the most important piece, because it's these relationships that really accelerate the supply chain. But let's dive in. Okay, so asset to asset relationships. I'll talk you through this little animation in a minute. So the example here is that we're talking about the product being linked to the components that were used to build the products. In this case, the materials, because this is like an apparel example. So the same capability can be used for lots of other purposes, like I say, like derivatives or translations, but it's really critical for a designer to see what materials were used. So I'm going to walk you through this. So I'll let it come back to the cycle here and sort of explain why. So we're looking at the jacket. We scroll down We have what materials were used. Oh, these fabrics and that button. I click on the fabric. It loads. I'm now looking at the material, and up at the top it says used in designs. Oh, it was used in the jacket and it was used in the other one, right? So that relationship has been captured. This relationship may already exist in other systems, by the way, so we can also maybe get this data from another system. But the point is that that's really important, and it's a two-way. So it's useful for finding assets, but it's also really useful when the designers are actually working with this stuff. And it may be one to many. You saw in that example, the jacket is linked to 3 different materials. You can't do this in just straight metadata. Like, you have to do this through relationships, because it's impossible to have all those fields and have all those relationships built up. So if you consider findability, you're trying to find a product, but you can't remember anything about it, but you remember one of the parts that was used. Like, oh, I remember there was a material in there and the color was super blue. And so you search for super blue, you find the material, and now you say, or color or type or supplier or whatever, and then you go, okay, now let me see all the products it's used in. Ah, there's the product, that's the one that I need. It's really extending it, that capability. So this is particularly important for 3D among other asset types. Actually, let me go back. So the other thing is that the same capability may be used for lots of other types of relationships beyond just like the kind of component structure between the sort of parent and the child of what material was used in what asset. Okay, asset to data. So you can relate assets to data itself, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be an asset. And this becomes really important because this is the key to tying into sort of operational data. So there are enterprise platforms that are used to manage all this work, all these activities throughout the supply chain, right? Like the obvious example here are product data systems like product lifecycle management, product information management, master data management. So let me go through this this little animation here. I'll wait till it starts over again. But basically, on this asset, which will on the jacket, we have some PLM data, right? And that's the main data you use for doing product design. So that's just in there as metadata. But we also may want to link it. So here we are, we're looking at the asset, there's our PLM data, but it's also linked to product data. So you see that Jacket Extreme 4000, this is just pure product data, right? It has a preview so you can see it. And up at the top, you'll see there's a tab that says related assets. Now I'm looking at all of the assets that are related to that product, including the padded jacket, but also maybe a bunch of model photography, maybe a bunch of campaign stuff. So the point is that you're tying together the supply chain by that critical data that exists kind of throughout the supply chain. So this is just one of many ways to do relationships. Let's put this in the context of an actual supply chain to maybe get a better sense of this. So what I did is we're back to the same slide, but I added on the bottom some examples of enterprise platforms. So you can see there's PLM that's used more in the earlier stages, product lifecycle management. It's all the data about how you build products, materials and costs and suppliers and all sorts of stuff like that. And then kind of further down, you have product information management, sometimes called master data management. And that's more used for all the information you need. So what you see on an e-commerce site, all the information about the product, but it can also be, stock status and inventory and regional differences and all that kind of stuff. So it's both are very important, but they're kind of used at different phases. So this is the idea, is that becomes kind of the glue that sort of holds this whole thing together, because each of these teams is working on what their work and what they have to get done, and they have certain data that they relate to. And then downstream, a different team is going to relate to different data. So there's not necessarily a direct connection between those two, except for that core operational data that already exists in these other systems. So I like to look at it this way when we talk about DAM for 3D. There's kind of 2 levels of value. One is just giving these teams core DAM capabilities, going back to the fact that they're working on SharePoint or whatever. This is huge for operators, especially if they're at capacity and they're being asked to do more and they can't get any more done. But the concept of that is productivity, cost savings. It's less impactful for executives than the idea of like a top line, like a revenue gain. But when you add in the integration with the data layer that I'm talking about here, it becomes a top line benefit. We're talking about accelerating time to market, dramatically increasing reuse, improving the execution quality. And we're talking about the whole life cycle, from product inception all the way out to sale and delivery, and potentially taking months off of cycles. So a typical product cycle might be a year or 18 months. That's a long time. There's a lot of risk in that. Markets change. If you could shave off even a month, that would be, a huge impact. And that level of benefit is much greater than what you typically see in DAM, where you're talking about, oh, we can get our campaign assets out to our e-commerce site more quickly, or out to our website, or out to social. Sure, there's a benefit there, but it's not as big as enabling a much bigger part of the pipeline. And of course, there's always going to be choke points in these. So if you can address those, you're going to get a big bang. It's not like you have to address every single one of these stages in order to get a benefit. So that's kind of the idea here, is that, and I want to point out, there's some other ones here like CRM, ERP. You could be a company that works with clients, customers, partners, franchisees, stores, and that's what your assets are related to. Or even ERP, maybe it's transactional. Digital rights is another example. I don't have this on this slide, but that's critical enterprise data. Another one you don't want to forget about is project management. You see I have it 4 times there on the bottom, because each of these teams may have their own project management tools that they use. It could just be Excel or Airtable. It could be Jira. It could be Workfront. It could be Rike. But it's critical data that is related to the assets. So I just want to point out that at a high level, this is really the glue that holds these whole supply chains together. And if teams take an insular view, we kind of know what happens there. It doesn't really accelerate the supply chain. And by putting it in this context, kind of gives you a different level of import. So let me give you a quick example of what some of the benefits of this enterprise data integration. Now, I'm taking a very small chunk of the benefit. I'm just looking at search, because it's something we can all get our head around. And so these are examples of how linking to that data, relating to that data, it kind of empowers search. And there's a bunch of others, and I'll try to rattle off a few. So conceptually, the idea is that giving users, content users, or asset users access to this data, and it empowers them to make better, faster decisions. Because the way it works in a lot of organizations now is the data is often some other system, and they either need to swivel chair, go into that system, use some SKU or style code or something to find what they need, and then they got to swivel chair over to their DAM, or usually a file system, and poke around and try to find stuff. And often they don't even have access to the data system. It's some other team, and it's some very intensive interface, and they limit who has access to it, and they've got to ask a team, and it's just slow and tedious, as you can imagine. All right, so let's go through these. So on the left, we have a product design example. So this is a product designer who's looking for materials. Let's again say apparel. They're looking for a fabric to use in a new design. So there's a materials library, great. And what can she actually use from the library? Well, it's not just about what's attractive or what's in fashion, or the kind of creative decisions, but also there's business constraints. She needs to be able to filter on what she can actually use or what's appropriate. So you can just see, I just took a bunch of screenshots here, but there's things like what brand is it and what season. Okay, that's pretty much standard metadata. You could just do that with straight metadata. But when you get to things like supplier or status, like is this ready for production? Is it in inventory? When is it going to be released? Is it going to meet my manufacturing date? Maybe you have environmental certifications, or in sustainability is huge in apparel. Maybe you even have metrics, because you have to meet a certain sustainability target for this product. But same for other industries. Maybe it's a safety certification. So if you're building something that has to meet certain compliance requirements, you may have to select that. Maybe it needs to be within a certain region, maybe, and weight, cost, all sorts of data there. But that data is usually not accessible, especially when someone's looking for assets. So that's the idea, is you're bringing these things together, you're presenting that data to that user, and it empowers them to move faster, make fewer errors and fewer reworks. So another example that I think we can all get our head around, which it really isn't specific to 3D at all, is digital rights, right? So, images of athletes or celebrities or models or whatever, right? There's digital rights associated with it. And a lot of times those are talent rights. So you could try to do some of this in straight metadata, but there'd be a lot to fill out and it becomes limiting. So imagine you have, I'll just say in this case, a photo, and there's 4 models in the photo. Each of those models has their own talent contract and their own rights. So you have to link out to some other data. Now, it could be in a DRM system or like an IPM system. Sometimes it's just in the DAM, but the DAM has to be able to maintain that as like a separate object in the system that you link to. I'm really trying to get at the linkage aspect of it. So I might be able to then filter. Oh, and the other thing is, from a search point of view, maybe I filter on talent, find the talent record, and then I can see all of the assets that are linked to it. Or even better, what if I have a thing where it's like, oh, we need to find all the talent that's licensed under California law within these time periods. Like, how are you, and you have to find all the assets that fall under that, right? So it's that kind of search capability. And also, we talk about project management, which could be at any stage of the supply chain, really. And so the idea here is that we have this project or campaign or whatever you want to call it, and there's data about that project, and the assets need to be related to it in one way or another. So let's say you're trying to find some great work. You want to reuse some work. Maybe it's 3D, and you really need to find this because it's weeks of work to build this beautiful model, and you want to use it as a starting point to make something else. But you can't remember anything about the product. You don't remember, all you can remember is kind of maybe who worked on it, like what participants, and then you maybe remember something about it. So you could do a search, winter sale, whatever. And maybe that then searches a creative brief that's part of your project data. You find the project, and now you can see all the assets associated with it. So it really extends the reach in search. But of course, it can be used for rules, automation, permissions, publishing, all that stuff. There's other benefits of this data, but search is a nice way to highlight it. So I have one other thing I want to talk about here. I'm actually doing okay on time. I'm shocked. Is this idea of immersive experiences. And the reason I want to highlight this stage of the supply chain is because it's driving a lot of expansion in 3D, and I believe it's going to be putting a lot of pressure on teams all the way through the supply chain. So the pandemic drove a lot of interest in creating these kind of virtual experiences, right? No one could go in a shop. So all the retailers were, just obsessed about this for a long time. But it's been happening long before that. It's just that was a kind of a kick. So the technology to enable these immersive experiences is great, and it's growing really fast. It's better product discovery, evaluation, commerce. And this isn't just necessarily for products. I mean, virtual museum exhibits. I mean, there's all sorts of educational, there's all sorts of other examples from it. I'm just putting it in the commercial product context. So here you can see we have some examples. So you've got those stunning 3D billboards in Japan, that Nike one, and Timberland below has one as well. I'm not sure where it is. Now, of course, that's a lot of flash, and it's probably made by an agency, but it's the idea that you're creating these more in-depth experiences, and that content has to come from somewhere. We also have a configurator like Vans right there. So this is build your own shoe, right? And I know actually for a fact that the content that you're seeing there is actually being fed from a DAM. So it's highly structured, right? There's all these bits and pieces that all have to go in the right places. So this is like an incredible experience for cars. You want to make all your selections of how you want your car and the colors and all that kind of stuff. And this isn't just for consumers. These kind of configurators can also be really powerful for, let's say, when a retailer is buying, like a sales portal. Instead of like sales samples, they can. So there's other reasons to have these visualizations. So that's an example. And then we have like AR stuff. Like on the right, you see. This is actually from the Home Depot app, where you take a picture of your room and you can change the flooring and that. So, and then on the top left it's not really asset oriented, but it's the idea of this sort of endless aisle. So it's sort of proximity based, or maybe there's tags that, it explodes. But it's awesome technology. But the point is, or this kind of begs the question, where does all this content come from? I mean, you consider the component nature of some of this content, like to the configurator. This can't be a bunch of files on a file system somewhere with naming conventions. It's too fragile. It doesn't scale. So it has to be fed from some kind of centralized systems. And each box in the supply chain can't be using their own little insular tools, or else you're never going to be able to feed that change. So developing these experiences requires much more than just embedding some great viewers in a website or a mobile app. It's not just the last mile technology, it's the pipeline of content. So this has to be sourced from up the digital supply chain. And that ties all the way back to the product designs, usually, right? So some of these immersive examples are just showpieces, like the Nike billboard. I'm sure that just some agency built that and it's beautiful and fantastic. But now someone says, oh, well, we want to be able to create an immersive experience for our whole product line. And we want it on the site, and our target is, next year. So then everyone says, okay, focus on all the technology and the website and everything. And then there's like, well, how are we going to get all that? And it has to be accurate to the product. So you really do have to go back to the source. And this is the part of the pressure. And the reason I bring this up is that there's a lot of interest in this and there's a lot of money going towards this. So when you talk about funding initiatives, and unfortunately, even though you have a big pipeline problem upstream, and a lot of these teams are really stressed and they don't have great tools, getting budget for a productivity improvement, or you could look at it like cost savings improvement, is often a lot harder because it's a bottom line gain. It saves money, right? Whereas if you do something that's going to create more sales, or in non-commercial, create better consumer experiences or goodwill or whatever it is, that's a top line benefit, right? That's like increasing the top line. So the way it's often worked that I see is this stuff gets all the attention and gets the budgets. But if the people that are implementing this understand you can't get there from here if you don't have this kind of technology, this kind of pipeline in place, we're never going to be able to actually scale this. You might do the beautiful one-offs like the 3D billboards, but that's all it's going to be. And for a lot of firms, that's kind of where it is. And the other thing is that if you can tie it back to the incredible reusability of these 3D assets for things like replacing photo shoots, which, like I say, a lot of firms, especially in the home furnishings, like IKEA and a bunch of other ones that use that really extensively. Obviously there are a bunch of ROI points that you can dial into, but the point is that there's a lot of effort going into these immersive experiences. And if you can tie into those projects, then you'll have an easier time probably finding budgets. It's not what they want to hear. They don't want to hear, yeah, you can't do this without us. But at the same time, it's there's a reality to it, and it's not that hard to explain the overall idea. So that's kind of what I had right now. I'm a couple minutes early. I'm actually amazed that I'm only 3 minutes off. What we're going to do at the hour is to invite in, let me just go to the next slide here, is to invite in Erica and Ben. I was going to have Erica probably go first. So what I was going to do is each of them will give a little bit of background, what their firms do. They can put a slide up or two if they want or whatever. And then we have some questions, and I hope that there's a lot of Q&A that's come in. So I don't know, Erica, are you already in? If you are, you could jump on. Otherwise, I could maybe just take some early questions if I'm ahead. But feel free, Erica, if you want to. Okay, you're there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing. And if you want, you can share, but you don't have to.
I can. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so glad that I hopped on early because you were definitely speaking my language. And I'm pretty sure that last slide had an example or two from Epic Games. So happy to see that. Yeah. Just to sort of take a step back and introduce myself. My name is Erica Young. I'm partnership manager for Sketchfab at Epic Games. And before jumping into tech, I was an industrial designer for about 12 years. So I mainly worked in fashion, footwear, furniture, and home decor products. So I come from the product development, world where I was actually developing tangible products and shifted over to technology. So now I sort of I help brands bridge the gap between product development and utilizing technology. So that's why you were definitely speaking my language. So tech can be used to streamline production workflows and also create content that supports the launch of products and create immersive experiences. And 1000%, you can utilize the same assets for both use cases. And Sketchfab does a great job of helping bridge that gap. And I can just sort of read a little blurb about Sketchfab, so I don't ramble on because there's a lot there. But Sketchfab is one of the leading platforms to publish, share, discover, buy, and sell 3D, VR, and AR content. We provide all the tools to easily store your content, then create a variety of immersive experiences like that Vans experience that you showed. So the experiences are for online, and we've been perfecting this technology for the past 10 years. Many brands across many verticals utilize our platform for a variety of use cases. We were recently acquired by Epic Games. So now Sketchfab can act as the starting point for storing assets and then deploying them to the entire portfolio of platforms and tools within the Epic ecosystem. So imagine taking that Van shoe, creating a configurator for an e-com experience, and then that same Van shoe can be worn in Fortnite. So Epic, the entire ecosystem provides that sort of workflow. So it's like endless possibilities that you can now, create using Epic products. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Erica. Let me, before I jump to Ben, let me also remind everyone, please post your questions in the Q&A, because that's this next half an hour. That's what we're here for, is to answer your questions. So with that, over to you, Ben. Feel free to share your screen if you want, but you don't have to.
Hi, everyone. My name's Ben Conway. I'm the co-founder and COO of Ventana. And we describe ourselves as a 3D infrastructure platform. So basically, what we're trying to do is add 3D capabilities across the entire product lifecycle. So from design to development, all the way to go to market. So e-commerce, augmented reality, game engines, Amazon, Google, other places we have integrations. So what's really kind of different about us and our approach is really, I'd say two things. The first is that we have built an optimization engine that allows us to automatically reduce 3D files by up to 99% while still maintaining super high visual fidelity. So one of the big problems with 3D is that the files are really large usually initially, especially when we're talking about fashion, which is where we work. So apparel footwear assets are at least 100 megabytes, if not hundreds, and all the way up to gigabyte plus, depending on the software package you're using. And so that's way too large to live on places like e-commerce or mobile or anything like that. And so what we've done is build this engine that can automatically reduce these files while still maintaining really high visual fidelity, but you can also optimize to certain specifications for different platforms. So what Meta wants is different than what Google wants, which is different than what you might want for e-commerce. And so we've kind of automated that workflow. And then the second thing is we have a headless architecture. So it's all over different sorts of industries. Everyone's talking about going headless because everyone's gone to the cloud. Workflows are getting more advanced. They want connectivity and interoperability between different platforms. So we have a direct integration with Nuxio, for instance, and a lot of that's enabled by the fact that pretty much everything you do through the front end of our platform, you can also do via APIs and API calls. I don't think we need to get into a demo of the product, but some of the customers we work with are like VF Corp, which is North Face, Dickies, Hugo Boss, North Face, Dickies, Vans, Timberland, and in certain cases, we're working with Sketchfab and Epic together on customers because there's some different capabilities there. So the 3D world is vast and there's a lot to do. So kind of our view is a rising tide floats all boats on this stuff.
We know each other well.
Yes.
Great. Yeah, I kind of figured that. Okay, cool. Well, so I thought we would just go into Q&A now. I have a couple topics I was going to kick off with, and then David is online. He'll be kind of managing Q&A. He may have some topics. So let me just dive in with some here. I really just have two. So when you guys speak to 3D teams that are struggling to manage their content, what is their near-term complaint? Because you bump into it actually probably more than I do, because a lot of these firms, they're not even necessarily thinking about looking for a DAM yet. They're trying to implement your solutions, and then they go, oh, we have all this content, we don't know how to manage it. So either of you can go first, but it'd be interesting to hear what you guys hear, because as DAM practitioners, we want to be able to speak that language.
I can.
Go ahead, Erica, you go ahead.
So it depends on the industry. So Sketchfab works, like I was saying in my intro, we work with many different verticals, many different industries. And so if you're talking about fashion, there's a lot of unique issues that come with fashion industry. For instance, a lot of brands don't have any 3D capabilities whatsoever. So they want to sort of a lot of times like jump ahead to, let's say embedding a 3D viewer in their e-com site, and they kind of don't know how there. So some of them do use 3D software like Clo, like Browseware, and but then sometimes their teams only know how to utilize those types of software for production purposes. It's very different when they want to turn that file into a real-time ready asset to then deploy it to their e-com site. And so a lot of times, sort of identifying the source of where their starting point, like whether it's a Clo file, whether it's an actual garment that someone needs to take and then create a 3D asset from. Everyone has a different starting point, and then optimizing it for real-time purposes. So Ventana is a fantastic optimization engine that can help with optimizing asset like that. And then you would be able to sort of upload it to a site like Sketchfab and then deploy it in all these different immersive experiences of different creative ways. But you got to sort of start the very sort of starting point of like what you have first. But just to sort of give a little bit of example of a different industry, like if you're talking about architecture, automotive industry, a lot of them work with CAD files. So CAD needs to be converted into mesh files, and then a lot of times that needs to be optimized. So it's really case by case, and the workflow varies drastically. So it's the starting point really where like a lot of people are, still scratching their head to get over.
I think Erica's got I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think Erica
Okay.
thorough answer.
So that's the challenge. You really got to know your industry. So
Yeah.
that makes perfect sense. Let's see here. One other one, turning it back on ourselves, being a representative of the DAM industry, what do we often not get? Like, maybe it's the same thing, it's just knowing the industries, but like, you guys have worked with, I've worked with both your companies, but I'm sure you worked with lots of other, and they may not even call themselves DAM companies. They may just be some kind of content repository, but what do the people who understand managing assets not sometimes get about the differences in your spaces?
Yeah, there's 3D is complex and 3D is difficult. So I'd say there's two things. It comes down to industry, certainly, and we focused on fashion for specific reason of it's hard to serve a lot of industries and have the feature set they want and understand the way they work. And so that's kind of why we focus where we have. So understanding that is really critical. And sometimes that doesn't happen. So I think like even with Nuxio, right, I think there's been some joint learnings with, like, you've onboarded some of these customers, and I think you've probably become so much more fluent in some of the language that people in fashion use that maybe you weren't a year ago. But the other thing is the complexity of 3D. There's not this understanding. The other large formats that they're dealing with are probably video, right? So video is a large format, but that's kind of a solved problem. Like even if you have a file that's a video file that's a gigabyte or a few gigabytes large, There's a player that can play it, and it's going to play it over time. You're not loading all of that at one time, but with 3D, you're loading it all at one time. And so that's what's really different. So they don't understand the viewers. It's kind of like, you know, like a JPEG is a JPEG is a JPEG everywhere. Not true of 3D. You've got different file formats. And there's even different viewers will look at the same asset and it'll look different. So one person's using Babylon, one person's using 3JS, it's the same file, it renders differently. So there's just a lot of kind of complexity there. I don't think that I don't think they need to necessarily get into the weeds. And actually, Joel, I'll send this out if you want the recap. We just put together a guide for IT to getting started in 3D. Basically, like we put together a whole getting started for IT teams of like, how should you be thinking about this? What do you need to understand? I think the interconnectedness of things is really, really important. Like to Erica's point of like, people want to just skip to 3D. Well, you can, but like, you're always going to have to go backwards. So like maybe you do it and you're deploying it for that one experience and that's cool, but like it's not going to scale in your organization. You're going to hit all sorts of bottlenecks and roadblocks. So like it's really important to be thinking about where are all the places that I want to go as you start to get into it, because it's never just one. You got to solve for usually multiple at once.
Great.
Yeah, Ben, I think it's, first of all, on behalf of Rutgers, let me extend a thanks to each of you for your time in preparing for this and for the insights and knowledge. It's such an interesting topic, and you are joined by dozens and dozens and dozens of digital asset management and other professionals who are grappling with this. And one of the substrate concerns that's echoed in Joel's very thoughtful and really fun to listen to. That was an awfully quick hour discussion, Joel. Thank you. And Erica and Ben, what you both said is there's a data governance layer here. And so kind of speaking of being in our swivel chair, along with understanding the borderless state of a lot of content and how it moves across boundaries so much today. And here we are confronted with a particularly complex object within this borderless world of content. And I was wondering if each of the three of you could just briefly comment on governance issues that you may have been involved with when this first started to become a chrysalis and grow. Erica, as you were saying, it starts somewhere and then gets, and what kind of governance concerns and data governance concerns that just the issue complex is fine, not looking for some grand solution, but issues that have come up and any guidance on the data governance perspective. And Erica, will have you give a little thought on that, and then Ben, and then Joel, please.
Sure. What I can say is that a DAM solution or even a 3D workflow is never going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. Not every fashion company is built the same, or any company, so you got to really, if you were to build a DAM solution for a company, I would sit and interview everybody within the organization and really understand their internal sort of unique workflow, because it will always be unique. And I would say that it will always have to be a tailored approach, because, and a lot of times there's people within these organizations that don't know technology whatsoever, but they're the sort of decision makers. And so you also have to make it very easy for people to jump in and review, click on things without really knowing much at all. So you got to sort of consider people's sort of skill level in terms of understanding 3D and how internal teams interact with each other, the various sort of states of producing a product. It's sometimes it starts with the merchandiser, and sometimes it starts with the designer, or it's just this one guy, the owner of the company, is like the starting point of sort of considering what product to create. And so I don't know. It's all I can say is that it has to be, it's easy to sort of get in the weeds and really sort of focus on the tech itself, but I would focus on the people first and how they would use the technology, and then governance and sort of the workflow would follow from that.
Great. Thanks, Erica. And Ben, anything particularly idiopathic to the data layer itself, to the kind of the data governance of what 3D expresses out, and how you've seen that become part of overall data governance strategies or operational concerns as you watch this, and particularly in your case in the fashion industry?
Yeah. No, in that there's usually what happens is that's the goal, right? That's what they want to do, is be able to do that. But to actually have seen people implement something that's more robust hasn't happened as often. What I will say is that there's a couple things that, like, because this stuff comes up and it's ultimately someone wants, there's a few things that we're integrating, like building on our roadmap. One of them is single sign-on. So being able to have single sign-on that ties to whatever, like teams environments, like whatever they're doing today. And the second is like building out more granular controls based on like the various users and what they can do. Like, we're finding that you really need a la carte role access for the enterprise level. Like, that's something that I think is really important. But we have tried to take the approach because there's a lot here, right? And a lot of times, like, it's not the 3D teams that control this at all, usually. And so we've tried to put it on the people like Nuxio and others who have more robust capabilities around that, and kind of just try and make sure that all of our plumbing works in such a way that we can respect those rules, respect the way that people want to govern data, but we are not going to be ultimately the place to manage that. And I think that's probably going to be the way that it works, because the
Makes sense.
2D is not going away anytime soon. And so you got to work alongside what they have today. Like, doing your own thing is going to be a big problem.
And if I
I'll tell
could
you,
add-
Ben, go ahead, Erica.
I think that open source is super important to throw in here. Like you have to be able to connect lots of different platforms in order to create the robust system that's appropriate for the user, for the brand. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, Ben, when you use the word a la carte, I was trying to picture the two of you designing some 3D cart, but never mind. I'm sure it could get very creative. And Joel, let's have you take charge of the questions that have come in, and would welcome your perspective, of course, of how I don't think this is going to follow all the video learning we've done. It's going to be different because
yeah. Well, here's what I'll say. That my whole point about integrating with the existing data systems, PLM systems, PIM systems, there is a lot of governance that's already in place for those. And they're pretty rigid. Tie into that, leverage that, which means that all the other systems, DAM and other components like Sketchfab and Ventana, to whatever degree that they're related, have to adopt that, have to adapt to that and follow that. Now, what happens often is that the team that runs the PLM system or the PIM system or whatever it is says, oh, no, we need to do this in our app. We need to do 3D in our, or like, and those systems just they're not dams. They can't do that. I mean, dams have enough work to go, we still have work to do to better support 3D. It's really going to be difficult for a PLM system to do it, right? But that's sometimes you get that push-pull where they're like, we're the governance people. So you want to partner with those as much as possible because they already have a lot of that control in place. And the same with project management. Like project management is kind of a form of process governance, right? So it's tying into that existing stuff. And that can help enable teams to practice more of it at the same time. But the actual data flow through the organization, this is why I say trying to like implement a DAM and use kind of all your own metadata and kind of stay insulated from those other enterprise systems is just really, really tricky, which, it adds an integration burden. And it's definitely been difficult for some of the customers that I've worked with it takes time to put those implementations into place, but they're really, really important. Okay, so I'll go to some Q&A here. Let me cherry pick one or a couple here. See a few more coming in. One I thought was interesting was the question is how DAM works in the gaming industry and how can it be replicated to other industries? Because I believe gaming industry handles huge 3D assets. I'll make a comment about it and then you guys might know more about it. So one of Nexio's long-term customers is a gaming company, and the actual gaming source files are not in the DAM. There's dedicated systems. They're more like source control systems. It's code, right? So they're more like source control systems, but where they needed a DAM was they needed an index to let people find stuff. Oh, I need a sword, you know, like I'm building something and where's the sword? I can't find it. So they would use the DAM index. So that it doesn't matter where the files actually are. They would use the DAM index to find the sword so that they could reuse it, even though the code is actually stored in a different system. So that's like one example of that. I mean, that's fundamentally what DAM offers is the data, the metadata that enables search and other types of control. But I don't know, I'll pass it to either you guys if you have anything to say about the gaming industry. I imagine you probably do, Erica, since you're part of Epic.
Yeah, I can add a few comments. So Sketchfab is focused on WebGL online sort of experiences. And so there is a cap. We basically suggest to import up to 500 meg files. And so sometimes that's not, you know, that's a little too small for game assets. But there's a guarantee, and we have sort of an editor space so you can do some quality control and really check the fidelity of your asset. But so in Sketchfab, there's a guarantee that it will be real-time ready. But when it comes to gaming assets, we have a product called Quixel Bridge. And that is a product where basically you can access game assets from our marketplace and download them and store them in your own sort of management system. We have a team that scours the globe 3D scanning assets. So they've literally gone to Antarctica and have scanned glaciers. And it's also game developers can utilize these types of assets in their games. And what Quixel does really well is that there's various quality like that you can download and import into your bridge or your folder. They also have materials, and so it's sort of is a bit sort of the assets vary a lot more within Quixel Bridge than in Sketchfab. And yeah, like they're able to sort of upload and store much larger files appropriate for game. I do want to also point out that Unreal 5 launched this year, and they now have what's called Nanite technology. And Nanite allows you to sort of work with assets with a lot more polygons, and the load time's a lot faster. And so like within the Unreal Engine, you're able to utilize assets that are way more dense. And there's a guarantee, more of a guarantee that it will work within your game. And so we're sort of approaching, you know, like creating the appropriate game assets in a lot of different ways. But Sketchfab is strictly for WebGL online purposes, but then Epic has other products that are more appropriate for game assets.
Yeah.
I mean, all I would say
on that? Yeah.
Gaming's been using 3D longer than anyone else, and they've got their own tools and they've got their own workflows. If I was going to be targeting an audience as a DAM provider, don't know that I would go there. Them in Hollywood have their own ways of working in the entertainment industry. And so there's a lot of they've got existing systems, and a lot of them are custom and tailor-made by the studios themselves, especially when you're looking at the AAA level studios. So that's just my quick comment on that.
Very true.
Let's see what else we have here. So one question I thought was interesting is, what type of metadata schema would you find yourself using for metadata for 3D assets? So I'll take a quick crack at that. Probably a bunch of different schemas. What is needed for a team that's doing product design? Well, first off, there's existing enterprise data. So you're doing materials design, or you're doing product design. You're probably going to be working with, like I say, a PLM, a product lifecycle management. So there's already a lot of important data there, but then the rest of the data is maybe your stages, like, we have draft, review, approved, expired, whatever your workflow stages are, that's going to be different from team to team. And so that's one of the challenges when you're trying to enable a whole supply chain is systems have to be really flexible to be able to support different schemas at different times, at different stages. There's probably some, and you guys may know more about this, that's really asset specific, like how assets are put together. I know there's a lot of complexity with components being used in other components and that sort of thing. But I also think in general, it's a lot easier to go too far with metadata. And sometimes you don't go too deep, and you give them enough, and then you let people make choices, because I think it's so easy to overdo it and try to go too deep in metadata, and then you usually just kind of trap yourself in it. But that would be my point is, but it would be interesting to hear from you guys if there's specific metadata that you think is really unique to 3D that should be used in a DAM. And I have no idea, I'm just putting it out there.
I think that there's specific metadata. The issue is the DAM administrator, the people who are actually accessing that data, it won't be relevant. It won't be useful to them. They won't understand what that means. And so what we're seeing is that it's pretty much following traditional schemas, even if there is some additional stuff in there. So, or we've recently exposed more data around file sizes, polygon counts, things like we're adding a lot more data to each individual product that will be accessible via API. And there might be instances where the customer is going to push that data along with all their traditional schema to Nuxio for the purpose of having those more advanced users be able to access it within there. But I think that's one of the things that you find is kind of problematic is the advanced metadata doesn't really have a lot of usefulness because the people don't understand it. So instead, what we're seeing is it's determined somewhere else, like on Ventana, that this is the appropriate file for the ads team that's going to be working on Google or Amazon. And so then it goes into that location within a DAM, but there's not actually different metadata. The metadata associated is the same. It's just in a different location that is specific to where, the specifications of that asset.
Yeah. For sure.
I agree with Ben.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, because the people that are actually using that could use that data probably don't. They want to know what it's for. They don't need to know exactly how it's built. You know what I mean? Or every little attribute of the thing. Yeah, totally. Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, that's how I would look at it. It's the same issue with DAM metadata across the board, right? You have the same issues, different teams with different content that have different purposes, and you've just got to do the workshopping to model that stuff out. DAM is all about the metadata model in the end. Let's see here. Let me see one other one here. Some of these are more on the kind of technical side. I'm just going to address this one. I don't know if you guys will have anything on it, but the question is it worthwhile to split databases into two parts, one for internal company usage and the other for external public, or is it better to centralize all of it? I'll quickly answer it from a traditional DAM point of view, but it might be interesting for you guys to think about it. Yes, I mean, there can be different data that's required for externals versus internals. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a split database. It's just the system having permissions on what data gets exposed to what teams. I mean, I guess you could do it. I have to say there's some very, very large consumer electronics companies that are extremely sensitive about exposing pre-release, products and such, and they literally have separate dams. It's so, even the admins, they don't want admins from the public side to even have access to. So there are times that you do that if they're extremely strict about it. But I think for me, more, it's just about configuration. But I don't know if you guys, specific to 3D workflows, if you've ever seen anything there where there's, because usually it's just a permissions issue. But like I say, if you're the right kind of company, yeah, you may need to do that. And what I find interesting about that consumer electronics company was it wasn't so much the users. They knew that they could hide whatever they wanted to hide from the externals. It was that the other people that have access to the systems, they didn't want those people to accidentally release things or whatever. David, did you have? Oh, okay.
Oh, I was just going to say I agree with you. It's more about a permissions sort of approach. We have Sketchfab for Teams where you can create different folders and change permission. I think the flexibility of moving models over and assigning or reassigning models to different people within the organization is important. And so I would keep it simple and just use one dam.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we're at the hour. I'm not seeing more questions coming in. If anybody wants to add anything, feel free to jump in. But I think this has been really good. I really appreciate you guys joining and spending your time on this. It's really, I think it's been really interesting. Certainly for me, I hope for everyone else.
Yeah, it's so nice to get this depth of perspective on an area of growth and elasticity and what we mean by an asset. And as we've looked at the progression in the time that Joel has contributed professionally to DAM and myself over 2 decades, to see the progression from pretty simple things, images and graphic files and whatnot, and then through an ever increasing capacity of asset management vendors and infrastructure providers to embrace ever more complex video and time-based media. We've witnessed kind of in the sideline a lot of systems doing something with CAD CAM. There are even dedicated DAM vendors who only work with architectural and engineering and rendering assets and do derivative PDFs that there's a viewer for, but only serve that market. And I think one of the exciting things here is with Joel's context, and as the two of you are thinking about data and accessibility along with the complex engineering challenges of where you both work, that we'll see an ever deepening capacity for the DAM systems to put these amazing assets to work. And it was so fun to see the examples, and I think all of us enjoy richness in our life from the technologies, Erica, that you and Ben are working on. And hopefully with Joel's insights and that of our many dozens of professional peers today, it'll just get easier and easier. Now, what we'll really want Joel to tell us is that how do we ask when we're shopping for DAM for the functionality of that swivel chair? That's what I'd like to know. So
yeah, I should trademark that.
Yeah, I think you should just put that up for sale, and we can just go from across the borderless states. So great. On behalf of Rutgers, I'd like to thank each of you. We will distribute the document that you sent along, Ben. Thank you for that. And maybe we'll have the opportunity to convene again to monitor the progress and reach in this. And on that note, this concludes our webinar. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and the three of you for your professional contributions and courteous engagement. We really appreciate it. Take care. Have a good forthcoming weekend and Halloween. Bye now.